his jaw protruded, how his brow ridge was so low, how his eyes used to pop out, particularly when he laughed so loud. You know he's a brother when he laughed loud like that. But the way they described him is the way in which they describe us even to this day. Yet because we are so detached from this, we don't see the role that we've played. Because they know that once we get to this and our children going, there'll be no problem with playing and understanding Beethoven. They'll understand why Alicia Keys would write a song using Moonlight Sonata. And why Deborah Cox and Whitney Houston would write a song, same play, different cast, I believe it's called, using Beethoven's Fur Elise as a background music. Because it's so close. When you listen to the work of the early jazz musicians, you're listening to the finger work of the classical pianists. And when you look at it, a quarterphone was born out of somebody stripping the head of a drum. Because if you looked at a drum, and if you take the head of a drum and you cut it in many pieces, you then can strum the top of the drum. That's what a banjo looks like. That's why if you took the head off a drum off, after you sliced it and turned it up, and then you played with the keys, you literally would be playing a drum, but you'd be playing chords. And this is where a quarterphone came from. And then they took the concept of the quarterphone and elongated it, and then they made a harp. And then it came to Europe, and they turned it sideways and encased it in wood, and they combined the concept of a quarterphone with a percussion, and they created a piano. Because back in Europe at this time, they don't have time thinking about trying to make an instrument. They're trying to find their next meal. They're trying to find a way not to die from these plagues. They're not interested in what Africans would bring into Europe through the Moors. But we can't even deal with these issues if we don't get into other issues. So it is with great honor that we honor our brother Joel Augustus Rogers. We'd like to give our brother a round of applause for all of this. You see, one of the things that I did, and see, this is one of the things that when Brother Big Man asked me to do this, there are things that you have to do that go even beyond what you can understand. And because of the nature that I really do want us to be out of here by 4 o'clock, so that those of us who would like to go to First World Alliance to listen to Dr. William Mackey, another brilliant historian, an elder historian that we all should be aware of. Dr. Mackey is another brother who, while he plays a very low profile, he is quite a brilliant individual. And he ranks up there with Dr. Ben and with Dr. Clark and all of the others who have been masterful historians. But just like I said to Brother Big Man and to the Grassroots Production, there's no way that I could possibly even talk to you about Alexander Dumas or to talk to you about Ludwig van Beethoven if we didn't talk about the French Revolution. Because you would have to understand the context that the French Revolution played in the development of European society that came out of the Moors coming in and bringing democratic principles into Europe for the first time. But again, because we have this concept that they created democracy, they never created democracy. The closest they ever came, and they tripped over it then, was something that came out in the 1000s called the Magna Carta, but that came out even out of the Moorish influence in Europe at this time. Because the Moors brought these concepts of individuals having human rights. And the idea that in having human rights, you had a right to determine your future. This was never heard of before. Religious freedom was never heard of in Europe before. Being able to be different from someone else was never heard of before. So we've got to look at the French Revolution. And the French Revolution basically occurred between 1789 and 1799. And the French Revolution really had a very strong impact on Europe. And it had a strong impact on Europe because European kings and monarchies would never be the same after the French Revolution. But you can't understand the French Revolution because I'm going to try to backtrack because I want you to see the whole picture, but we don't have time to get too deep into it. So when you get home, for those of you who have computers, punch up the French Revolution to find out a little bit more about it because you'll understand this evening's lecture better by understanding the French Revolution. See, because nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Professor Clark was right. Nothing ever happens because it happens. Something always brings something else to occur that brings something to occur. So So that when we're looking at the French Revolution, what you've got to see is what occurred, how long it lasted, and why did it occur. The background of the French Revolution occurred because of social, political, and economical conditions. The lower and middle class was very dissatisfied with what was going on in terms of their being controlled. There were new interests in ideas about government and the financial problems caused by wars. But now when I came upon this information now, I'm at a stumbling block. Because what wars worked? What wars occurred that would lead to the French Revolution and the dissatisfaction of the French people? What wars were they? There's a war again called the 7 Years' War. See, this is all stuff we learned in school. But because we never learned it in the context of our own selves, it never made a difference to us. For those of us who did pass the test, we only passed the test because we wanted to pass the test and move on. But we never really got into it to see the relationship it had with us as an African people, because there's a relationship with this particular war. The 7 Years' War was from 1756 until 1763. What's interesting about the 7 Years' War is that this was really and truly the birthplace of World War I. And why do I say that? Because nearly every nation in Europe, including America and India, was involved in this war. Because at this point in history, remember, the European powers outside of Spain and Portugal now are getting firepower. They're getting access to the seas. They're beginning to create charters that's sending pirates to the Caribbean to beat the Spanish and the Portuguese. Because remember, when the world was cut in half between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, what's happening now is that there are other countries that are now becoming aware of this information. They're now becoming navigators. And they're beginning to say to themselves during this period of time, before this even, they're beginning to say, now, how am I going to get a piece of the world? And Spain and Portugal say, well, you can't get a piece of the world because the mightiest person on the planet divided the world up at the Treaty of Tordesillas. And they gave everything west of this line to Portugal. And they gave everything east of this line to Spain. This is why in current day history, people have to be careful when they talk about this is America, speak English. Because the first European language spoken in America was Spanish. Florida, California, Las Vegas, San Antonio, Texas. It wasn't English. Later on it would become Dutch. Later on it would become English. After you start these wars going on. Because remember, the world was broken up by the Pope between Spain and Portugal. But why? Because Spain and Portugal were the ones that had absorbed most of the information from the Moors. So they had the most information, they had all the gold, and they gave all of these influences to the Pope. And in thanking the Pope for all that they had given him, the Pope then divided the world and gave half to Spain and half to Portugal. But then you have all these countries saying, but that means for the rest of our lives that Spain and Portugal will always rule the world? And we'll never get a piece of America, we'll never get a piece of India, we'll never get a piece of China, we'll never get a piece of Africa? Oh no, we got to do something about this. And so they say, but what can we do? The most powerful man on the planet, which at that time was the Pope, has already, by divine decree, in the idea of being infallible, in other words, his decisions are God's decisions. Nobody can make any decisions beyond him. How can we get a piece of the land? Well, they did something very interesting. They just said, well, who's the Pope? Why don't we develop somebody that we're going to call the Archbishop of Canterbury? And why don't we build the Church of England around that Archbishop? And that way the Pope's not going to have no influence over us because he's not our spiritual leader. So that's what they did. And then they called themselves the Protestors against the Pope. And this was the birth of the Protestant movement. It had nothing to do with somebody wanting to change their religion and divorce their wife and marry somebody else. It had to do with money. It had to do with the control of the planet. This information would now lead to these kinds